Okay, picture this. A country where you could be thrown in jail just for saying what you think. Imagine living in a place where expressing your opinion could lead to your arrest, where the government controls every aspect of your life, and fear is a daily companion. This was the harsh reality for millions of Syrians under the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, ruled with an iron fist. His government was notorious for its oppressive tactics, silencing dissent through intimidation, imprisonment, and even torture. The people of Syria lived under a constant shadow of fear, unable to voice their grievances or demand change. But then, in 2011, everything changed. Inspired by the Arab Spring movement sweeping across the Middle East and North Africa, the Syrian people found their courage. They took to the streets in massive numbers, driven by a collective desire for freedom and justice. People had enough. Millions of everyday Syrians took to the streets, demanding a better life. They were tired of the corruption, the lack of opportunities, and the absence of basic human rights. The protests started peacefully, with citizens holding signs and chanting slogans for change. They wanted the freedom to speak their minds, fair elections, and basic rights. The demands were simple, yet profound: an end to the dictatorship, the establishment of a democratic government, and the protection of individual freedoms. The protesters were united in their vision for a new Syria, but instead of listening, the government fought back with terrifying force. The regime's response was brutal and swift. Security forces were deployed to crush the uprising, using live ammunition, tear gas, and mass arrests to disperse the crowds. The peaceful demonstrations quickly turned into violent confrontations. It was a real David and Goliath moment, with ordinary people risking everything for a shot at a brighter future. Despite the overwhelming odds, the protesters stood their ground. They faced tanks and heavily armed soldiers with nothing but their voices and their determination. The courage displayed by these individuals was nothing short of extraordinary. The world watched in disbelief as peaceful protests were met with bullets. International media captured the harrowing scenes, broadcasting the violence to a global audience. The images of bloodied protesters and chaotic streets shocked the conscience of the world, drawing widespread condemnation and calls for action. Things spiraled quickly, and soon the entire country was engulfed in a civil war, dragging in other countries and turning into a global crisis. What began as a quest for freedom and dignity devolved into a brutal conflict, with multiple factions vying for control. The war drew in regional and international powers, each with their own interests, further complicating the situation. The humanitarian toll was immense, with millions displaced and countless lives lost. Syria became a symbol of the high cost of tyranny and the enduring human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. Now, the war in Syria isn't a simple story. It's a complex and multifaceted conflict that has drawn in numerous players from around the world. It's a real head-scratcher, with different groups inside and outside Syria all fighting for their own interests. The conflict began in 2011 during the Arab Spring, when protests against President Bashar al-Assad's government erupted. To understand what everyday Syrians went through, we need to untangle this mess. The initial protests were met with a brutal crackdown by the government, leading to a full-blown civil war. Over the years, the conflict has evolved, with various factions and foreign powers getting involved. On one side, you had the Syrian government, backed by big powers like Russia and Iran. Russia provided military support, including airstrikes, while Iran sent ground forces and advisors. Their goal was to keep Assad in power and maintain their influence in the region. On the other side, a bunch of different groups opposed to Assad, some wanting peaceful change, others more extreme. The opposition was fragmented, with groups like the Free Syrian Army seeking democratic reforms, while extremist groups like ISIS and al-Nusra Front pursued their own radical agendas. And caught in the middle? Millions of innocent people, their lives turned upside down by the violence. The humanitarian crisis has been staggering, with over half of Syria's population displaced either internally or as refugees in neighboring countries. The war has left cities in ruins, families torn apart, and a generation of children growing up amidst chaos and uncertainty. International efforts to bring peace have been ongoing, but the path to resolution is fraught with challenges. Various peace talks and ceasefires have been attempted, but lasting peace remains elusive. The international community continues to grapple with how to address the complex web of interests and grievances that fuel the conflict. Despite the devastation, the resilience of the Syrian people shines through. Communities are slowly rebuilding, and there is hope for a brighter future. The road to recovery will be long and arduous, but the spirit of the Syrian people remains unbroken. For decades, the Assad family ruled Syria with an iron fist. Bashar al-Assad, who took over from his dad, continued to crush any opposition. Forget about freedom of speech or assembly. If you dared to criticize the government, you could be imprisoned, tortured, or even killed. Fear was a constant companion for Syrians, always watched by the Mukhabarat, the secret police. Remember the Arab Spring? It was a time of immense upheaval and hope, a period when ordinary people took to the streets to demand change. It was like a wave of protests for democracy that swept across the Middle East and North Africa. From Tunisia to Egypt, from Libya to Yemen, people were rising up, united by a common desire for freedom and justice. And guess what? It lit a fire in Syria too. The spirit of rebellion and the quest for a better future didn't stop at Syria's borders. It spread like wildfire, igniting the hearts and minds of countless Syrians. Inspired by people power-toppling dictators in Tunisia and Egypt, Syrians saw a glimmer of hope. They watched as long-standing regimes crumbled under the weight of collective action and thought, why not us? Syrians dared to dream of a different future. They envisioned a country where their voices mattered, where they could live without fear of oppression, and where their children could grow up in a land of opportunity and peace. In March 2011, a group of brave teenagers in Dara painted anti-government messages on a school wall. These messages were simple, yet powerful, echoing the sentiments of a nation yearning for change. Their arrest and alleged torture sparked a wildfire of protests that engulfed the entire country. What started as a small act of defiance quickly grew into a nationwide movement, as people from all walks of life joined in the call for justice and reform. The seeds of discontent had been sown, and the flames of rebellion were now burning bright. The Syrian government's response to the protests was swift and brutal. They unleashed their forces on unarmed demonstrators, shooting and killing dozens. But instead of silencing the people, the violence only made them angrier and more determined. As the protests grew larger, the government's crackdown intensified. Tanks rolled into cities, helicopters fired on civilians, and thousands were arrested, tortured, and even killed. It was a truly dark time. Even though the violence was relentless, the Syrian people refused to be silenced. They formed local groups to help those in need, providing food, shelter, and medical aid. Doctors and nurses risked their own lives to treat the injured in secret hospitals. Ordinary citizens became journalists, bravely filming the horrors unfolding around them and sharing their stories with the world. The Syrian people, once living in fear, had found their voice and were using it to fight back. Sadly, the uprising didn't immediately achieve its goal of removing Assad from power. The conflict dragged on, turning into a long and bloody civil war that has killed countless people. The Syrian people were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, with millions forced to flee their homes and become refugees in other countries or within Syria itself. Despite the unimaginable suffering and loss, the spirit of the Syrian people remains strong. They continue to demand freedom and dignity even with their country in ruins. Their struggle is a powerful reminder of the human cost of oppression and the incredible strength of hope in the face of adversity. The Syrian uprising is a story of both incredible bravery and heartbreaking loss. It shows us the resilience of the human spirit and the terrible consequences of war. The Syrian people's fight for freedom and dignity continues to this day. Their story is a call to action, urging us to stand with all those fighting for a better world. It reminds us that the pursuit of peace and justice is everyone's responsibility. If you enjoyed this video, smash that subscribe button. We're almost at 200 subscribers. It'll help if you did. I'll see you in the next video, but for now, May al-Salamati.